To reiterate what I stated yesterday in the prior video, energy is of three types from the materialist's point of view, namely the physical sciences like physics and electrodynamics. We'll get to the origin of that in a minute. But the way we deal with energy, it comes in three types, but we're only amuse ourselves with two of those three. And we don't even consider the third. The two that we consider is brute force to keep the circuit alive, and a kind of comatose or death, or near death, comatose state of the circuit in which you've got a little bit of energy there, but it's not worth even sneezing at. And the qualification of brute force is voltage regulation. That's what voltage sources do. They regulate. And so they prevent death or near death, such as comatose, but they also prevent the third type that we avoid looking at, and that's surges, because they freeze the voltage at a certain level. And that's why I tickle my circuits with I've always learned this early on. You tickle with a small amount of energy, and never more than a small amount, small comparable to what you're going to end up using in here or creating. Because if you use too much, you'll send the circuit into a comatose or death state, either one. Mostly just comatose, actually. Nothing really dies once something gets going. It never completely shuts off. Only in the world of the simulators do you have to start from a cold start, but most everything in reality already has a little bit of a charge on it to one degree or another. But be that as it may, it varies, of course. So mostly things go to comatose, and the brute force of voltage is meant to prevent that. And so then we have to go recharge our batteries because we spend it tremendously in order to keep up this brainwashed condition that we have, and all of our consumer appliances are tied to it. But the third condition of a surge, one of two things can happen. Either the thing blows up or it goes comatose. It's a very precarious balance between the two extremes. And so we call it resonance. When a system gets into resonance, it goes into its overdrive, and it creates this, abundance of energy, and then you don't know what to do with it. You got to find ways to get rid of it at a controlled pace. If you get rid of it too fast, you'll go comatose on the circuit. If you go too slowly, the circuit will either slowly surge, or if you don't even bother to get rid of the energy at all, it'll just blow up in your face all of a sudden rather than slowly. So energy, we're brainwashed to think you have to buy it, you have to get it, you have to pay for it, when in reality the reverse is just as true. You can give it away for free because you have an abundance to give away. The other anomaly, or lie, if you prefer, that we're taught is that the sun is burning nuclear fuel, and when it gets spent, it will blow up and turn into a white dwarf. That's a bunch of nonsense. Blowing it up or turning into a white dwarf simply means that the surge went out of control, and instead of a controlled synthesis of electricity, it synthesized it too quickly and blew up, or too slowly, and it turned into a white dwarf. Because as Eric Dollard says, the only purpose of the wire is to serve as a meeting ground between the three ingredients of electricity, namely time, the dielectrical, which we call the electrostatics, although I like to say the electromotive force, but be that as it may, and the magnetism, which we can also probably infer the magnetomotive force. Those three ingredients. Now, Oliver Heaviside solved the transatlantic cable problem back in the late 1800s because he looked at the whole problem. The people of his day were looking at it in terms of brute force of voltage only, that's the only solution, that's the only problem, and that's all we have to consider. They forgot about magnetism. Is a short-range phenomenon, yet we depend on it for everything. We don't depend on electrostatics a whole lot. I mean, Ben Franklin played with it a little, but for the most part, we depend on magnetism, electromagnetism, electromagnetic radiation, such as light, heat, radio waves. Those are all short-wave phenomena that short-range phenomenon that occur among particles of matter that are closely spaced, such as the atmosphere or the Earth, or a conducting medium such as a piece of wire. But out in empty space, there's not enough proximity between atoms to allow electromagnetic radiation to occur. You only get electrostatics, and that's all you get, and it's instantaneous. There's no speed of light to worry about. The speed of light is how fast the atmosphere of the Earth will respond to a voltage change over in the sun. But nothing travels between the two because let me back up a bit. The speed of light is the electromagnetic response. There's a delay. But the electrostatic response in the atmosphere of the Earth to changes in the voltage of the sun is immediate. So we get this appearance of travel when all we really have is a time delay. And that time delay actually is related to there are two equations that are very similar. We have the E equals mc squared, and then we have the square root of both sides, in which E becomes the dielectrical force, mass becomes the magnetism, and the square of the speed of light becomes simply the speed of light. So the speed of light is a time delay for electromagnetism to erupt from an electrostatic change in matter being affected by other matter across any distance in space, short or long. But when we square both sides, we get mass, gravity, on the one side of the equation, and we get energy on the other side. Because electrostatic force is not energy as we know it. It's only when we square it that we get energy. Now, the thing to consider is that we can either acquire energy or we can give it away. If we acquire it, we pay for it. If we give it away, it's free. That's why we call it free energy. But it has to be done within a certain window, a parametric window, a boundary condition. Not too much per unit time do we give away, and not too little. If we give away too little, we explode. It's called spontaneous combustion of the human physiology. If we give away too much, we go comatose because we're so burnt out from overactivity. Tom Hanks, there is a video. You got to look this up. He's interviewed doing impressions of Clint Eastwood. And then, I don't know if it's that interview or another one. It might be, no, it's another one. I'm sorry. The Clint Eastwood impression video is cute. No, I'm thinking of a different video in which he's being interviewed, in which how he found out about transcendental meditation. He found out from Seinfeld. Seinfeld told him about it because Tom Hanks complained to Seinfeld, "Oh my God, I'm feeling horrible. For 4 hours every day between 3 in the afternoon and 7 at night, I am deadbeat tired. I can't work. I can't write. I can't do anything. I am so exhausted." You know, he'd been working like 6 years nonstop. And so Seinfeld turned him on to TM. You should try it. And now those 4 hours are the most productive hours of Tom Hanks' day, all because of TM. Well, the point is, what's the point? Exhaustion. Okay, there was a point to this. Renewal, exhaustion. What was the point? Oh. He spent too much energy comparable to what he was acquiring. And during TM, we acquire a lot of energy. During meditation, we don't realize it until we come out of meditation and ease into activity, and then we find out what kind of change occurred during the meditation process. You know, we gain intelligence, we gain creative energy, and we gain bliss, but we don't realize it until we go back into activity, what kind of change occurred in meditation. So it's a real kind of paradox or irony that we go into a state of deep rest in order to get more energy, let alone more intelligence and more bliss. It's a strange paradox of opposites, but be that as it may, that's how the human gets free energy. But we cannot spend more than our nervous system can handle Our nervous system is limited. It's not the almighty nervous system. It's the nervous system of a limited human being. So we can meditate and be a yogi and all, but there's still limits. And even yogis who are enlightened vary in their ability. Their darshan varies. The darshan boundary of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was a 1/4 mile radius. That's how far his darshan went and then stopped. And other yogis, it just goes a few inches, maybe a few feet away from their body, even though they're enlightened. Everybody's karma is different. And the Almighty is not subject to karma, so, the Almighty is Almighty. The Almighty's darshan is infinite, but ours is limited based on our karma associated with the body, the physical body. Okay, so a free energy device has its limits also along the same lines. You spend too much, it goes comatose. You spend too little, it explodes in your face. You have to have a self-regulating mechanism so that you never go to the two extremes, and that's what this spark gap does. It's supposed to fire at a certain rate in order to dissipate the excess energy that's bound to happen. It has to happen because you're in a surge condition. When you're in a surge condition, you're in a giving state. If you don't give it away, you blow up. You're in a blow-up state, if you prefer, an explosive state. That's what, the one irony, the irony of the Nazis in World War II is they were, like the Romans, they were really into destruction and abusing humans, and they were really into explosives, big time. A lot of their technology was in how do we destroy people and how do we destroy things in the most efficient way possible. Well, that's the way the Romans were too, oddly enough. And the Nazis, highly regarded themselves as the reincarnation, the Third Reich, the Third Roman Empire. The Byzantine being the second. Anywho, the irony, though, is that with all that energy, if you don't explode it, if you regulate it, then you have it in abundance enough to share within a certain limitation of how much can you share per unit time. It's all about per unit time. Excuse me. It's all about per unit time. Because, it's not enough to say, 1 unit of energy. You have to say 1 unit of energy per unit time. And then you're making a complete statement, because it's a very timely thing. Energy is timely. It's here and then it's gone. It's all about movement. Energy as we know it, the physical manifestation of energy, is all about movement, and we're brainwashed to think you have to pay for the movement of energy, because that's all we're doing. We're moving energy from point A to point B. And we're taught to think that we got to be billed and charged and pay money to move energy from point A to point B, when all we're doing is moving it. And that's all energy is. It's movement. It's movement. That's all it is. Now, getting back to the origins of that physical, materialistic point of view, that's only one aspect of energy. From the Vedic standpoint, the Vedas specify traditionally 5 qualities to energy, yet it's all one and the same energy. It's 5 in 1, 1 in 5. You can't separate them from each other, even though all we do in our Western science is to focus on just one of the 5. The term is prana, and it's very indicative of the fact that it is 5 in 1, because there are only 4 distinct terms for the qualities, for the 5 qualities of prana, because the generic term for all 5 is the same one for the most important singular quality out of the 5, namely the breath. So when we want to talk about prana in general, we use the term prana. When we want to talk about the breath aspect out of the 5 qualities of prana, we call it prana. And then we have to specify, are we talking generically or specifically, because we're using the same term. So that's very indicative of the 5 in 1 structuring of prana. Now there are besides the breath we call prana, there are 4 other qualities. There's thought, called udana. There's digestion, called samana. There's elimination, called apana. And then there's the materialistic Western physics standpoint of energy, called vyana. Vyana is the quality of prana having to do with circulation. You know, the blood flow, um, rain, wind, anything having to do with energy that moves. Yet we are brainwashed to think you've got to pay for energy because the only way to move energy is to acquire it. Well, let me tell you something. The sun is not burning nuclear fuel that will get spent. It is synthesizing electricity, and it has to do so within a certain boundary condition, because if it goes too fast, it'll explode, and if it goes too slow, it'll go comatose or come close to dying or die altogether. But usually comatose is the more popular way to go extinct. Nearly so, for most part. You know, he could probably go up and touch it and get a mild sensation of heat, you know, but not enough to blind you or burn you or send you. Something along those lines, if you get my drift, relatively speaking. Not that we should go and test out that theory. I'm just using metaphors here. So, first of all, we don't see energy in the context of a broader perspective of what energy is. It's far more vast than just the materialist standpoint that physics focuses on. Secondly, within that limitation, it makes it so easy to start to lie and misrepresent the situation and think that all we have to do, or all we are allowed to do, I should say, is pay for acquiring energy as if it were a log of firewood, which it is not. That's chemistry. That's not energy. We can release the energy of chemistry, or we can release the energy of a nuclear bomb, but that's not energy. That's simply plutonium or a wood log. That's physical matter. We're paying to acquire the physical matter. That is not the energy that will get released. But if we deal with a circuit, a free energy circuit, we are no longer dealing with a log of firewood or a mass of copper wire. We are dealing with time. Time becomes the source of energy when we get down to the root of where does energy come from and where does it go back to and what medium does it travel within. It doesn't travel in space. The physical manifestation of energy is in space, yeah. It has to, or else we won't get the benefit. But it travels in its own medium called time. And when we realize this, then we realize we have to manipulate energy with time alone, using space to do it, the components in our circuit. But ultimately what we are manipulating, you know, think of it this way, a doctor trying to deal with a biohazard situation, what does he do? He doesn't just put on gloves and a mask over his face. No, he goes big time. Two of my favorite movies I have in my collection have to do with some kind of biological germ that can destroy the planet unless our heroes and heroines can take care of the problem. And when they get a sample of this stuff, they can't deal with it like a doctor in the operating room. They have to go big time, big scale. They don a spacesuit, or they stick their hands with rubber gloves into a little incubator that has the sealed box that has the germ in there, because they can't let any exposure, not even to their skin contact, nothing. The ventilation system of the room cannot, circulate this thing and make it become airborne. It's a really big-time biohazard, so it really has to be isolated in a very quarantine fashion, every which way they can think of. What was I getting to? Well, energy is not bound like that. Chemistry is, Nuclear chemistry is. Nuclear matter is. It's plutonium, or it's a wood log, or it's a candle. That's chemistry. That's not energy. Energy moves in time, it comes from time, it goes back to time. There's this expression in the Vedas that we are beings of bliss, we come from bliss, we travel in bliss, and we return to bliss. And we are always in bliss, and all of this is bliss, and nothing but bliss is this. Well, with energy, electrical energy in particular, we can make a parallel statement. It comes from time, its nature is time, it's timely. You can't have yesterday's energy, it's not going to be around. You got to use today's energy now. You got to use the now energy. It travels in the now, it comes from the now, and it returns to the now, the eternal, dimensionless now. It has no dimensions. It's zero dimension. And this is the only reference to the 0 point of the vacuum of energy field that people are referring to. It has nothing to do with the vacuum of space. It has to do with dimensionless time. We have 3 dimensions of space, okay? That's our circuit, the reality our circuit and our physical matter and gravity exists in. Then we have the 2 dimensions of when 2 dialectrical lines cross prior to them creating physical matter and physical energy in the 3rd dimension. Then we have 1 dimension of the dialectrical lines of force, and then we have the 0 dimension of time, from which comes all of this manifestation of the physical world. And then we have the transcendental field, which is even beyond 0 dimensions. So we have 5 different stages of dimensionality. Transcendental dimension, transcendental 2-dimension, dimensionality. Then we have 0 dimension. Then we have 1, 2, and 3. So we end up with 5 different pranas because there are 5 different stages of evolution to the manifest world. And the last one, of the least significance, is the one we deal with and live in, this physical reality. It's the last one in the totem pole, in the chain, daisy chain of events, of materialization. And it's the least significant, and yet it's the most significant to us, but spiritually speaking, it's the least significant because it's the tail end of the creative process. It's not the beginning, it's the end. It's where we get to enjoy the benefit. We get to smell the rose and go, ah. But the rose went through several layers of manifestation before it reached the point of becoming noticeable to our senses. And our senses went through an evolutionary process to the point that they became physical senses so that we could experience physical roses and enjoy them in a physical way. So I hope I covered everything, but the one thing is that we don't only have to acquire energy and pay for what we acquire. We can surge it within ourselves in a controlled fashion, not an uncontrolled spontaneous combustion, but a controlled fashion, not an uncontrolled comatose situation, but a controlled fashion in which we produce just so much, no more, no less, and spend it within those parametric boundaries so that we don't lose the gift that we have. And that means we have to regulate what we're doing, and that's what the circuit has to do. It has to constantly regulate what it's doing, or else it's going to lose that opportunity to be a giver. And then we'll have to go back to brute force and pay through the nose, which is what we do when we install solar panels. I'm sorry to go here, but somebody was bragging, that he doesn't need free energy. He's got solar panels up on his rooftop and tax credits. And what does he need free energy for? He's already got free energy. Well, guess what? He's got a job, or else he wouldn't be able to pay for the house and be able to have tax credits because he wouldn't be taxed. If he didn't have a job, he wouldn't have income to be taxed. So you see, it's kind of a loaded argument, which he left out the loaded part, and he just talked about the benefits. And then he has to go to work, unless he had inherited wealth. He was just born with it, right? Or some rich uncle died and left him all the wealth. But see, even that's going to be taxed. So now he's got tax credits. He can take off from the purchase of and installation of the solar panels on his roof and never have to be plugged into the grid ever again to recharge his electric vehicle or to run his home. So you're still tied to the system. The whole point of free energy is you untie yourself and you run independent of the system. That's the whole point. And the military-industrial complex does function separate from the system. That's why it keeps all this knowledge to itself, because it doesn't want us to become sovereign in the same way that it is, all-powerful, independent, self-reliant. Yet the days of the pioneers, that's what they did. You were on your own. You had nobody to tie into. You either made it or you died. You trek across the continent on the Oregon Trail, and they had to bury a few people along the way. And the Indians and the Native Americans went through the same thing. The forced marches to new territories they were forced to move to, a lot of them died along the way. But it's, in a sense, it sounds horrible to even suggest to you to go back to something similar to that. Yet what else is free energy? That's the implication. The sociological implication is to go back to a state of self-reliance. You share with maybe a few of your neighbors, because you do have to give it away. You're going to be producing too much for your own use, but that's about it. And there's no widespread grid to hook into, and no widespread grid of authority to suck up to and kiss ass. Okay? And pay the bill, pay the piper. What's the point of taxes if you don't have money, right? You don't have an income because there's no money, so that you can't be taxed. and thus your behavior cannot be modified to encourage certain behaviors over others that you might try to get a write-off and a refund on. It's not going to happen. So social modification, it goes out the window. A lot of things go out the window. So that's why free energy is limited or privatized, shall we say, to the military-industrial complex alone and not allowed to go outside those boundaries. And the pain is the pain of death. You know, what happened to Stanley Meyer? He's not alive to write his memoirs. He never got a chance to write his memoirs. And Nikola Tesla was planning on writing his memoirs, retiring at the age of something like 130 when somebody did his biography. They interviewed him and they said, well, I expect to live to be about 120, 130, 40 or something, and then I'll write my memoirs. He never made it, did he? Well, some story has it that he was strangled by Hitler's bodyguard because they didn't want us to find out that he shared with them via Wernher von Braun 2 years prior to the war, or for 2 years immediately prior to the war, his secrets. Because they were the only people who were paying attention to him and listened and cared. They were stealing from him for over half a century. And that was the last theft, just before the Nazi invaded Poland. So, I think I covered everything. But I wanted to go over some of yesterday's points because they're kind of significant. We have this lopsided view, and it's across the board, you know. We're monotheists when where it does not belong. Monotheism only has to do with the abstract level of reality, which has nothing to do with the relative, but we apply it to the relative with dire consequences. The relative is duality, it's opposites. There's one point of view, and the opposite point of view is just as true. And this is an old Greek thought, but has died a quiet death, and nobody's noticed. You know, in a lot of movies, outlaws are depicted as creative individuals. And they're considered outlaws. Well, what's the word outlaw? It doesn't mean a criminal. It means you live outside the law. What does law mean? Social organization. And in our case, the social regulation is to prevent us from becoming our own generators of electricity and energy. That's what it amounts to. We're outlaw if we do that, and so we become targeted. That's all I'm going to say. I could say more, but I don't need to. Yeah, I've said enough. So that's why most people don't go there, because they don't want to be outlaws either. You know, shunned, laughed at, ridiculed. You know, what happened to Oliver Heaviside? He was stoned by the local children in his neighborhood because he was considered weird, you know? But he was ridiculed by the Royal Society of London because he solved the transatlantic problem the correct way, mathematically looking at the whole thing and leaving nothing out, particularly magnetism. That part of energy that dies a very quick death if you don't look after it and baby it. You know, unlike the electrostatics that can take care of itself, magnetism has to be looked after and babied and pampered and constantly nurtured and nourished, or else you lose it, and then when you lose it, you lose electricity, because electricity is founded on the two pillars of electrostatics as well as electromagnetics, long-range influence as well as short-range influence, always in the context of time. So you really got to look after energy on a constant basis. It's not something you just start and then walk away from and leave it alone. You know, unless you create a device that can last for thousands of years without any servicing, and it keeps spitting out, electricity. If you're so fortunate to make such a claim like Tesla did, at one point in his career, he could make a generator that would last 5,000 years and it was solid state and require no prime mover. That's not bad. This is not that. Well, in theory, this is that. No, in theory. That's right. That's what I focus on. That's right. What do you think the sun is? Does it have moving parts? Do you see any moving parts? And it lasts more than 5,000 years, that's for sure. All right, enough said.